Thank you for joining us tonight for Follow My Eyes, Sigue Mis Ojos, part of the Lit and Lose Festival of Language, Literature, and Art. I am Mia Lopez, and I am a curator, writer, and educator based in Chicago. I am happy to be moderating tonight's discussion. The Lit and Lose Festival was proudly produced by Make Literary Productions. This year's Chicago Festival Remix, Respond and Rebuild series of virtual programs began on October 3rd and closes October 9th with the Lit and Lose live show finale. Lit and Lose fosters the creation of new art through international collaboration and essential dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. Through conversations and the creation of new art, writers, artists, and musicians participating this fall reconsider past festival themes while also responding to issues and events currently impacting the United States and Mexico. The full lineup of participants and schedule of events are available at litlose.org. We hope to see you there, which is back here. We'd also like to thank tonight's presenting partner, Tiger Strikes Asteroid. Their current exhibition, Caroline Kent, Victoria Veronica, The Figment Between Us, is on view until October 24th. Tonight's event will include conversations and studio visits with multidisciplinary artists Alejandro Jiménez-Flores, Caroline Kent, and Luciá Hinojosa. As suggested in the event title, Follow My Eyes, Sigue Mis Ojos, viewers will virtually follow along with me on these visual conversations. They will see firsthand what these three artists have recently been working on and have the chance to ask questions at the end of the conversation. This event includes live audio translation in Spanish. Click on the Zoom link below to listen. So to begin, I'm actually going to read brief bios of all of the artists before we get into the individual presentations. Alejandro Jiménez-Flores is a process-based conceptual artist making gestures that occupy the space of painting, writing, and performance. Their practice is concerned with how the language we have or lack subordinates our subjectivities, identity formations, and the space that we are allowed to occupy. So we're now going to see a short video of some of Alejandro's work, and that will also be accompanied by some poetry that they have written, and so they'll be reciting aloud.
So you of course know the journey of the monarchs, what a mirrors, what a metaphors, and let me tell you that perhaps being told you're not a real monarch, it's maybe a relief. I am a monarch with the lowercase m. No. My name is Kiki. I was one of those butterflies, and let me tell you, I always felt more comfortable when I was an egg. I could see, I could feel, sense every single part of my body, moving, forming, thinking, being, becoming. I went from being one single blob, plop, and now there was two of us, a mirror, an awareness, a desire to become them, to absorb them, to become whole again, a longing. Plop, 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 flop. Y esa estrella creció grande. Now that I think about it, that first plop might have had a bit of a flop. My other me was a bit different, I noticed, and I knew I must be different then. As a caterpillar, I love gossiping with the flowers. They are the best. They let me eat their buds because they saw I was different. Fabulosa. Quizás conspiraban para convertirme en una flor. I heard someone say, "You are what you eat," and I was a flower bud, gossiping with them. And then, one day, I felt the sky not move, so I hung upside down, like a bat, from underneath a leaf near the Bishop's Falls. I liked the moment of stillness. For a second, I felt what it was like to die. Nothing moved. Did I die? Ay, un stomach cramp. Toda la sangre se me subió a la cabeza y mi cuerpo líquido empezó a tomar forma. Oh, mira qué piernas. Alas de nueva colección de Gucci que mi abuelita me mandó en un gene hace 2 vidas. Me quedé en este tiempo más que los demás. anhelaba el sentirme así más. Because I stayed in the form longer than others, processing all the secrets the flowers hid in their buds, when I came out of my shell to spread my wings like a bat, I was alone. And everybody else was already flapping about, forming groups, playing games, y yo, aguitado, bummed out, thinking back to that first plop. I flew and I tried to catch up with the group. When I arrived, they teased me for being late, and someone made a remark that my spots were different. I told them that it was the Gucci handbag my nana had sent me in a jean 2 lives ago. Ah, es la Gucci. Ja ja ja, que Gucci que nada. Ay, este salió rarito, medio extraño. They had formed roles to perform, patterns to follow, and I kept stumbling. It seemed like they were doing it on purpose. Oh, Kiki, tú no eres una monarca real. You're not a real monarch, Kiki. That's it. I couldn't take it. If I wasn't a real monarch, then I flew away. Missing my fabulous flower friends, they understood.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, for sharing that with us. So some of our viewers may recall the work that you had featured back in 2018 when you participated in an exhibition that I organized with Esteban King that was part of Lit y Luz. And it's, that was work that was very similar to some of the first images that were included in that video. And I'm hoping that maybe what you can share is sort of how your consideration of flora and fauna, particularly butterflies and flowers, but how that has evolved over these last 2 years to what we saw in this video today.
Hi, everyone. I guess I'll first explain the flower part since it's kind of like progresses from there. So around 2017, 2016, I started to focus on only making works about flowers. And I was using flowers as a stand-in for myself in some way. My second last name is Flores. So I was, I started to, at first I was taking photos of the flowers and then making compositions. But partially the reason that I started working with flowers is that I needed to get a bit of distance, because before I was having this, there was a lot of hesitation for me to make work, because I felt that any marks I would make in the canvases or surfaces, that my identity would be read onto that. So that kind of created this weird block of that kept me from making. So I started working with transfer techniques. So using soft pastel as a transfer to give space to the subject's flowers so that my hand wasn't present there. So I did that for about 3 years, and I stopped taking photos of flowers myself because the whole reason was to create this transfer process and to use flowers to mediate myself, was to create space to develop a preferred language as opposed to impose another language to flowers. So friends started sending flowers to me, images of flowers with text, via text. So I use those images of my friends thinking about me through flowers to try to create a space to create a preferred language to develop and mediate my own identity. So while that was happening, an element that was always part of my art practice was Florencio, who had different names at the beginning, but now to make it easier for everyone. And also, I'll explain the name Florencio in a second. I decided to just put under the umbrella of Florencio which is a conceptual persona. And it really kind of began from poetry and writing. I took a poetry class in my last year of school, and wrote a few persona poems, and just kind of like letting, I feel like Florencio as a framework is allowing small voices or minoritarian subjects to just give them full agency, and which for me it means I stop making my own practice and I surrender and facilitate Florencio's practice, which has layers of collaborating with other people. So a few of the images that we're seeing kind of halfway through, there was some, they're painted, they aesthetically look very different than the soft pastel works. So those were flowers, and the prompt for one of them was listening to the small voice, and I had Florencio, and given that agency, Florencio said that I should ask my mom to teach me how to draw flowers again. And so I went through and I had a Skype session, and she taught me how to draw flowers like she taught me when I was little, and then gave them the same space and the gallery space, and credited like Florencio. Usually in the titles there's like it's credited who Florencio is triangulating with, like me, my mom, Florencio. So that's how the later works that were shown at the last 6 works. It's the most recent body of work. It's part of Florencio, and it started with 2 years ago after being at a bar, Danny's, and like I used to go there dancing on Thursday nights. I wrote on a piece of paper, like make a series of paintings of monarch butterfly, like in the urban landscape, trying to like fit in or something. So then that sat on my desk for like 2 years, and eventually Florencio picked it up and wanted it to become this. There was this narrative impulse, and then Kiki happened, where Kiki became the story of a monarch butterfly that was migrating with the monarch group, but Kiki didn't quite fit in there. So it was this kind of like, through Kiki kind of like mediating this like double marginalization of not fitting in within a minority that is itself transitory, like migratory, and how to find a place to belong. So the story of Kiki is that Kiki eventually just wanders off the group, finds an unattended Aperol Spritz, takes a sip, and there's this brain thing where it's like, this tastes familiar yet unknown, and then there's this kind of like search for a place to belong that winds up being at a nightclub. So that's kind of like the trail of my practice and how it's
from Alejandro to Florencio to Kiki. And I wonder, as much as that feels in some way kind of like a linear sort of progression and evolution, do you see yourself kind of going sort of back in time to some of, the earlier gestures or aesthetics, or do you see yourself perhaps continuing to explore incorporating, personas for collaboration?
I feel like I used to sometimes describe myself as a time traveler, and when some people ask me about like Florencio, I think of Florencio as being like a being that is like ancient and like it's always been there. It's just kind of like accessing language is this way of sensing things, and like I can see Florencio in Italo Calvino's work like Cosmo Comics, or I can see Florencio in like Umberto Eco's Baudolino, and like that kind of energy of play with language and way of perceiving the world. So I definitely don't see things linear at all. And even my self-pastel practice, my works, those usually are made from an image that I receive. So it's this static document. And then I make a soft pastel drawing. And as I'm drawing, I transfer it to multiple surfaces, and the drawing is never finished. So then that process itself creates like a broader temporality and gets rid of that document origin, and it becomes more of this multiplicity of temporalities. And so yeah, the way that I put in the slides was in the time order that I have exhibited those pieces. Mm-hmm. But some of those pieces where sometimes there will be like a plaster piece, like plaster and soft pastels that I have done in 2016. And now that's what I'm doing now too. So it's like, I feel like there's loops within materials and subjects within my work. The thing about Florencio, it often involves other people. So my mom, or with Kiki, I've been collaborating with Miguel Jiménez as well. Florencio asked me to reach out to him to create a short story about Kiki. So what I did was I channeled Florencio via either wearing a perfume that Matt Morris had created to embody Florencio, or sometimes so there's like a ritual that I go through to kind of like strip away from like my authorship and then become this facilitator. So I just supply as core, and then Miguel had full creative liberty to create this short story, and now it's gonna become a book. So with Florencio, there's this impulse to have pure play with language, and also expands, like it's not just painting. There's been sound pieces, perfume, book. So yeah.
So that idea kind of sort of expanding, beyond the two-dimensional is a great transition. I have other things that I want to ask you about later, but first I'd like to turn to Caroline Kent's work. Caroline Kent is a Chicago-based visual artist that explores the relationship between language, translation, and abstraction through an expanded painting practice. Developed through an ongoing archive of works on paper, the paintings built out of this context exist in multiple forms of drawing, painting, sculpture, and performance. Kent labors to expand the discourse of abstraction to include alternative logics that move beyond surface and fame through each act of translation from one medium to the next. So we're now going to see a video related to a current exhibition of Caroline's work at Tiger Strikes Asteroid.
Victoria Veronica, The Figment Between Us. This exhibition is the first iteration of a project that I've been building over the past several years. I approach this space as a sketch, or a rehearsal, to bring the world of these sisters to life. To me, the sketch is an idea in flux that exists as one thing, with the possibility of becoming something else. The potential in a sketch is open-ended because it's just the beginning, and laying it out as a kind of scheme helps me put something of substance down in the place of what was once just existing in my head. In this exhibition, you will see works that carry a visual language developed between two fictional identical twins. The names Victoria Veronica are taken from my mother's first two names. The desire to use a fictional framework that was guided by factual and biographical information was a way to help shape the project. I myself am an identical twin, and it became poignant to not overlook how twin communication, secret communication, as well as an abbreviated form of communication, could be conveyed visually. Whether or not one is a twin, I think the desire to share an intimate language with someone who is kindred is not uncommon. For this project, I wanted to look at how a painting language could function as correspondence on an intimate scale. thinking about a relationship between two sisters was a way for me to produce a series of objects, paintings, and furniture that orbited a conversation taking place in a domestic space. Memory holds a psychic connection between the sisters. They both experienced seeing a unique table in the home of Mexican architect Luis Barragan. The upright table is the psychic stronghold between them in the room, a form whose presence is felt and seen in other objects and images in the space. The table itself contains a history between the sisters that is noted through a collection of various items on the desk: typewritten notes, pictures, artworks, and old books converted into small paintings. These twins are not physically sending each other letters through the post, but instead they are creating telepathic responses and dialogues that are felt between them. I see these sisters not only distanced physically, but perhaps even through time, so that the actual separation of the sisters might exist across dimensions. Perhaps always attempting to bridge the gap between themselves through these artistic gestures and exist in a common space together.
So for our viewers, that video really is so, I think, as close as you can get to experiencing the exhibition in the space. So thank you for sharing that for people that potentially could be streaming in from very far from Chicago. One of the things that I wanted to kind of start talking to you about, Caroline, is sort of knowing that you have this larger two-dimensional painting practice that many people that are viewing may be familiar with, but how does this immersive installation relate to that? You're now seeing things go well into kind of not just 3D, but also video form as well.
Yeah, and also the objects on the table and things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that both bodies of work kind of relate back to this kind of origin site of questions of how I think about abstract painting, thinking in and around abstract painting as kind of the foundational way that I interrogate and question that happens within my practice. And so I would say that when I'm thinking about language, the large scale paintings that I do that maybe more people are familiar with the all black grounds that they hang flat against the wall. That for me is a way that I can see language move from the wall to the two-dimensional through objects, through the three-dimensional, and then to freestanding objects, with these different acts of translations that happen. And so I really took a step back to look at this abstract formal language that I was creating to think about what happens when I expand that and what can be gained in expanding the language beyond just the surface. And then it occupies the forms of objects that accompany the paintings. And then it moves into freestanding sculptures that also are in the space. And through each active translation, I'm guessing and I'm thinking and I'm kind of seeing that this language has more to give us through these different gestures. And so when I ended up creating performances to go with those paintings, I saw that things became really illuminated with this language, that they didn't stay static. They wanted to take up an environment and they wanted to occupy space. And that was really exciting for me to kind of investigate in those ways. It kept me engaged. It kept me questioning. It kept me wondering what's the potential in having the painting as the site, the beginning site for other things to come out from. And prior to the large scale paintings, I worked from an archive of images, an archive of paintings on paper that often are the starting place for other kinds of works. But particularly with those large paintings, though, it was this way to kind of start on one surface and move and see how far I could actually push it. And sorry, my light just went off. My light. Oh, I don't know if that's coming back on. Anyway, it's a little dark. There we go. So in relationship to that, thinking about the Victoria Veronica work, I had questions regarding thinking about this language and could it operate in a more intimate way? I mean, the large-scale paintings are kind of commanding in their presence, and they operate out of scale, you know, and that blackness shifted from a color to a space when they went onto the wall. And so thinking in the terms of how can I have this language operate in a very different set of terms was exciting to think about, and shifting it to an intimate correspondence between sisters was a space that I had thought about for a long time. As I grew up, I'm an identical twin. And so in thinking about these different ways in which language operates in the world that I live in, I started thinking about the unique relationship between identical twins or very close siblings even. And what I found was that the piece that kind of made the most sense was that our communication over the years, you know, from childhood, we didn't have a totally secret language that was invented between us. We did have some words. I remember my mother telling us we had some words we would say to each other, and my mother had no idea what we were laughing about. But what I realized in reflecting over the way in which we communicated was that we largely spoke in very abbreviated ways, in condensed ways, because our experiences, which really were the context for this communication to happen, were very similar backgrounds, very similar experiences, very similar ways of seeing the world and moving through the world and understanding it, so that when we saw similar things, we described them in very similar terms and very similar words. And we also had references that were very close to each other's. And so it made sense then to think about how this abstract painting language could then occupy the space of a language between identical twins in the work.
So one of, you know, the concepts that's so central to this work, you know, is visual conversation. And you mentioned, you know, that this project has been ongoing for some time, but I'm wondering, you know, particularly, you know, during this quarantine, when our forms of communication and correspondence have changed so much, how did the work evolve, or did it? You know, was there any, you know, kind of new challenge or opportunity that this created?
You know, during the quarantine, I used the mail a lot more for writing letters than I have in a long time. And I think also something else happened during that time was that it slowed everybody down. Everybody was a lot slower. And I think that when one takes in an image and takes in a form, I think there is the way in which the work is presented that can allow for a slower read. And I think I wanted slower moments happening to really get at that these twins feel something that's communicated is felt through an object. And so in that space at Tiger Strikes Asteroid, I wanted there to be a lot of space between things. I didn't want a lot of objects. So I made the table, you know, the upright table, the main kind of focal point that I felt everything else flowed out from.
So let's talk about that table a little bit. You mentioned now in the exhibition kind of accompanying sort of text that it was inspired by the architect Luis Barragan, and it has several objects on it, books that are kind of covered in painted material, some film stills, and some written text. And I'm wondering if you could tell me about a few of those items and maybe how they contribute to the idea of this shared language between the twins.
Yeah, so I guess it's important to say that, you know, the two twins are a framework, really. So it is not a literal communication with my own sister. That was more of a starting point to really think about this. I think the framework or the fiction of these two sisters really was exciting for kind of the space to play within, and maybe very similar to what Alejandro was talking about. I mean, I identified so much of what they were saying and articulating. It was fascinating. And I think that a lot of those forms on that, a lot of the things that were on that table, they connect to my practice, because when you are looking at abstract painting, a lot of the forms or gestures, or in my painting specifically, they come to you without revealing their site of origin or where they're from or where they came from. And a lot of the material on the table were some of those references. So there was a reference to film stills with subtitles. There were handkerchiefs that had been put through the typewriter with these poetic expressions on them. The literary has a strong influence as well in my work, and using these old vintage books that kind of have lost their value in some ways, because their thrift stores are full of these books, and homes, I see them on my shelf in friends' homes, books that sit there and you only see the spines of them. And I thought, the sisters are operating in this domestic space to each other. What are they using that's already in their home? And so the books seemed to like come alive when they were treated differently on the surface. So I covered them like a painting and started making these paintings on the surface. And there's something that they both kind of send to each other. And so in the show, there's no distinction between this twin made that, this twin had this thought, had this memory. But the show is kind of held together by the upright table, which they both recall seeing in the architect's home. And that becomes, and that I find that that's what operates in a personal way with my sister, is that we both have a very specific memory, and then from it, a lot of discussion flows from it, laughter, and when we can pinpoint a certain thing, and I use that in the space. And so anyway, I hope a lot of the references, and there are older artworks on there too that I've made, and so it was also a way to really bring in a personal narrative, biography, heritage around that table in a way that made sense. And I felt like this was the perfect opportunity to do that made sense within the practice.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I definitely will circle back to a few things, particularly about how some of the text influences. But now I would like to move on to Luciá Hinojosa. Luciá Hinojosa is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, and editor from Mexico City. Her practice develops through a series of conceptual, ephemeral gestures and performative trajectories as a method of investigation that results in a corpus of visual, sonic, and text-based works. She's the co-founder and artistic director of Disonare, an experimental editorial project. So we'll now see a video of Luciá's work, and then we will hear from her. So thank you so much for sharing that video with us, Lucia. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about, so we just saw a really broad selection of your different types of works. There were, of course, some sound elements, photographs, video, and text. What have you been working on most recently? Oh, Lucia, you are on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Mia, for inviting me and to Lit and Loose as well. And that video was very kind of random and raw, so sorry if it was all over the place. But it's really the broad aspect of my practice, I guess. There are so many avenues that we can take and talk about, but I think that my main interest, of course, is language and text. I work with performance, with drawing, with video, with sound, but it's always accompanied by an element of language or of text. So what I've been working on, I've been mostly working on poetry at the moment. The video that you saw is the first part of the video. Well, the part where we see some printouts or pages in the landscape is part of the exhibition that you curated with Esteban King, the So Close, Far Away. So I wanted to include a part of that process, which has been a very long process. It's a project that started in 2016. It's called Land Waste and it's a poem the very famous poem, The Wasteland, that I typed and printed out and put in different parts of the landscape in Mexico, in abandoned parts. And I'm really surprised by all the connections between Caroline and Alejandro, because in my practice as well, there's always an element of the intimacy of the archive and the surface, but also the intimacy or the longing even, or the desire of bridging the gaps between a family member, sorry, or something that is connected to ancestry, even though if it's hidden in the work. So, for instance, in this project called Land Waste or Tierra Perdida which started from 2016 and 2017, I visited these places as a form of ritual, once a month for 1 year, just documenting the erosion of the text on the surface of the landscape in different parts of Mexico.
It looks like Lucia is frozen, unfortunately. Let's see if we can get her back on.
Me froze here.
Unfortunately, we sometimes cannot anticipate these types of technical problems. Lucia, you froze for a moment. You were talking about ritual, if you want to pick up there.
Yes, sorry. Right, I was talking about, am I on now?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I was talking about ritual and this work called Tierra Perdida El, or Land Waste The, which is really an impulse of the poetic dissolution of the wasteland. But this impulse started with the death of my grandmother. And I really wanted to kind of experience the mourning process through the dissolution of this poem. Of course, the poem was very connected to her and just the whole aspect of poetry in my life and in my work. But also this idea of a kind of patriarchal poem that was written, before when the First World War finished. So from the perspective of eco poetry or investigative poetry, kind of put the poem in the land, and also collaborate with other forces, which is the force of the land. So in a way, it's like a homage to my grandmother as well. Mm-hmm. But also on another level, it's just an exploration of a feminist, I would say probably feminist or just feminine aspect of this poem. But this work, this time-based work, I usually work very impulsively, and then I kind of try to understand what am I doing and what forces I'm collaborating with. So even this is a project that I started in 2016. I still have all this footage of sound, of photographs, of film. I'm working on the film now. So this is something I've been working on during quarantine. But also, as I was saying, I've been writing a lot, and I started this series of poems that are inspired on family archives, called the Telaraña Circuit. Telaraña means spider web in Spanish. So it's kind of this longing for, or I don't know if it's longing really, but sometimes what we have of ancestry is more of this archive. So it's kind of trying to not reconstruct, because we'll never be able to reconstruct anything, I guess, but it's just connecting with this archives. So for instance, my aunt, she was an archaeologist. So it's also, she died some years ago, but it's also based on this archaeological patterns of consciousness. So I don't know if I still have time, but I could read a little bit of these small poems, if that's okay.
I would love that.
Okay. So this is the first poem, and it goes, everything is pure projection, like a non-developed film on someone's shelf next to other objects. We're inside the virtual infinity scroll, but the reality of the image will never be revealed by light measurements hitting, waiting for your perception. 5,000 years have passed since the first inscription of gesture, a fossil like a dead wave at the shore, or the etymology of chaos, meaning formless, primordial matter. We met between bardos at the initiation of pattern consciousness. Image, noise, truth, only in the dark room. Experiment the moving shape of memory, the archaeology of sound. This vacuum is our thread relation, a series of questions that are also open like breath to breath, your deathbed in your mother's room, your whole life an archive of inhalations. You were unearthing a city covered in deep time. San Martín Huamelulpan in the Mixteca Alta. Score, notation, ossicles, found memory like a found object, a field for animated cavities, locality of erasure. How do I read the music that was city, that was room, that was unseen, like the image of my mother's elbow on your pillow, holding your last breath? So those were two poems.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was really beautiful. What a treat.
Thank you.
I actually am wondering if we can bring back Alejandro and Caroline into the conversation, because I want to sort of expand this discussion around language. You know, Lucia, your work and reading of that poem is just a great sort of transition.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we have Alejandro and Caroline back with us. If y'all want to unmute, that would be great. So one of the things, you know, that has, I think was such an important thread in the exhibition that you were all included on, you know, was the connections between all of the conceptual uses of language in your individual practices. You know, with Caroline, we see, you know, everything from, you know, an abstract formal language to, you know, the use of subtitles, and then, of course, you know, this correspondence. With Alejandro, you know, the poetry as performance and even kind of reciting some of the poetry yourself. And then, Lucia, you have, you know, this notion of language as a living system and a means of kind of building connection, perhaps, you know, to archive, but also as a way of kind of, I think, transcribing emotion in sort of a present moment. And I'm wondering if you could each kind of talk to me a little bit about how, although, you know, we have had a robust conversation around text in a conceptual way, I'm wondering if you could talk about what happens when you commit it to a visual medium. So whoever wants to jump in, I know it's a simple but loaded question.
I can start. For me in my practice, I'm thinking about the typewriter and kind of the handkerchiefs that have these poetic sayings and musings typed on them. I think for me it was this way that I could be free with writing and have it exist in a visual way. I didn't have the pressure of, I mean, I don't claim to be a poet, but I enjoy writing, and I found that it finally found a place in my practice. Again, I have other works that work with kind of invented text, invented musings that I use as subtitles or quotation. And so for me, there's just a real freedom to be expressive, to be poetic in a way that is so different than the way that I'm normally thinking about language. And it gets to be rich because I can borrow from all these other influences that don't maybe have a presence, that hadn't had a presence in the practice until then in doing that. So I find it very freeing, and it's another way to reveal myself actually in the work too. So.
Thank you.
I would also build on that, because actually when Caroline was talking about gestures, and also Alejandro, and about just objects, you know, the presence of objects, they're so charged with language. So there's an aspect of language that is semiotic, that I work with it a lot in sound poetry and in concrete poetry. But there's also an aspect of language that I'm sometimes more interested, or similarly, but that it's communication, you know, it's expansion of I don't know, of collisions or of meaning. So everything is charged with language. I think the three of us also work with memory quite a lot, and with the idea of ritual, I think we all work as well. So also this new things I'm working on that I don't even know what they are. It's like these little amulets that they're just stones with feathers and with duct tape. But for me, they are kind of words. They're words that I can use and that I can change. And even if I have a table and I arrange it, I know I'm in a way kind of arranging or rearranging language to see new things come out of it. So I think that's also what Caroline does in her paintings, in this abstraction. So yeah, the visual element, I think it's really, really powerful.
Gracias.
I guess my relationship to poetry, I feel like I remember taking that poetry class in the last year of college and feeling kind of this freedom. Like I am really bad with grammar, both in Spanish and English. And poetry became this kind of like expressive force for me, where you don't need to follow the rules of grammar and the juxtaposition of words, generate different meanings. So that's where I see poetry as like a powerful vehicle that navigates or like soars around this kind of like norms of grammar or proper understanding. So for me, the poetry that I write often works as kind of a trace of personal notes or documentation. And then those are woven in with sometimes literary references or, but they usually the way they operate within my practice is, or they have, I play the poem usually recited by Siri, and then I perform a dance, and then at some point in the poem, dance becomes part of the poem. So it becomes this other way of accessing a language that I cannot access through painting that deals with wordplay and kind of like mutating that. But then that informs the paintings and everything. So yeah, it's kind of like, for me, it's like part of the process. That's why I go back to it.
So we have time for a few questions from the audience. And audience, we're still taking some questions if you would like to submit them. But Alejandro, I actually have a follow-up for you regarding the use of your personas in the work and this notion of freedom, and if perhaps maybe they help enable you to feel more liberated in some way.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to finding poetry as a vehicle to navigate against this like norms and like find a space to create true expression and give as much agency to that force. So yeah, I find that while I was like mediating my identity through working with flowers and images I would get of flowers with that friends would send me, throughout this whole time, there was also like this constant communication, maybe similarly like Carolyn, with Florencio, that was helping me build this framework of how to approach this subject and create this space for the flowers to develop its own language. And then it became about giving equal space to this other framework that was helping me facilitate that. So in a way, with Florencio, I feel like more of a facilitator, and it's my job to surrender my practice and facilitate the painting and making of the paintings, Florencio's paintings, and to involve and to make this language bridge between collaborators that involve writing, perfume making, sound, and crossover these different languages as modes of different ways of perceiving and interacting with language itself.
Thank you.
If that makes sense.
Lucia, we have a question for you. Wondering if you can explain some more about archaeology consciousness.
Wow. Am I here? Am I? Okay. Sorry. Sometimes I freeze. Archaeology and consciousness. Well, I also work a lot with the idea of deep time and just like ecological thinking in a way. So an archaeology of consciousness, I kind of refer to this idea of the dissolution of something that is external or something that is physical. And I think this is one of my main obsessions. Just material reality and how material reality appears, and just the kind of the immaterial archive that we all share through language and through voice and through memory. So when I say like the archaeology of consciousness, I mean sort of this free exploration, but it's an exploration through the experience, perhaps of imagination, but also with the use of like a scientific language, how we share sort of the DNA of trees, it's 80% the same as our DNA, or this kind of things that go back to time as this cosmic time.
Okay, so I think that because of time will have to be the final question, although as we're all here together, I feel like there's so many things that I would love to talk to you more about. But I want to first thank all of you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time. There is a question about whether there are plans to bring you together perhaps again, and I would encourage everyone to look at the Lit and Lose archives, which I believe have some information about the exhibition back in 2018. So the festival would not be possible without partners including the National Endowment for the Arts and Illinois Humanities, as well as the MacArthur Funds for Arts and Culture at the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation, the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, the Illinois Arts Council Agency, and the generosity of individual supporters. All of this year's programming is free to enjoy. If you'd like to show your support with a donation, the link to give is below. So please stick around for a word from tomorrow night's host. And thank you so much. Oh, Alejandro was showing the program from the show back at Sector. So yeah, maybe I need to get with Esteban and we're gonna bring the gang back together next year. We'll see. But thanks again, everyone. And like I said, we are now going to hear from some of the hosts from tomorrow night. So have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello, my name is Jose Guadalupe Olivares. I want to invite all of you to join me and Jimena Gonzalez on October present and host Lit y Luz.
Este festival es un encuentro entre dos países donde tendremos nuevas colaboraciones, así como videos de antiguos participantes. Para más información, ustedes pueden visitar la página litluz.org.
It's going to be virtual this year, and we're going to have collaborations between different types of artists from Mexico and from around the United States. And it's going to be a really good time. I invite you to join us October 9th. For more information, you can visit litluz.org. Hello, my name is Jose Guadalupe Olivares.